Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the first week of Bike and Build's 2020 Why We Ride speaker series. My name is Eric, and I'm the program director for Bike and Build. If you haven't heard of Bike and Build before, we are a nonprofit that organizes cross-country and regional bicycle trips to benefit affordable housing and empower young adults for a lifetime of service and civic engagement. So typically every summer we have these teams out on the road biking from East Coast to West Coast, but unfortunately this summer due to COVID-19, we had to cancel our summer cross-country trips and regional trips. And so while our teams are out on the road, they're interacting with community leaders, build partners, affordable housing leaders, really getting an idea of what affordable housing looks like nationwide. And so this summer, in order to recreate some of that experience, we are hosting this summer-long series where we will hear from affordable housing experts from around the US. Affordable housing is a complex cause. It's about more than just a home. It's an issue deeply entwined with education, racial equity, public health, government lending, transportation, fair wages, zoning laws, and so much more. And so through this series, we hope to dive into the nuances of the cause, hearing from a diverse range of speakers, all working towards a common goal of fair and affordable housing for all. This week, we are excited to dive into an overview of affordable housing with our guest speaker, Ivan Marchena. We're so thankful to Ivan for joining us and sharing his knowledge about the cause. Ivan was a trip leader on one of our routes in 2019 and has firsthand knowledge of Bike and Build's mission and impact. And outside of the Bike and Build world, Ivan is a paralegal advocate in New York City, working for the Tenants Rights Coalition at Brooklyn Legal Services. So we'll hear from Ivan for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end. If you do have questions throughout his presentation, feel free to toss them in the Q&A box. And so we're going to try to make this as interactive as possible. And so we'll be using the raise hand feature. Ivan's going to be asking some questions to the crowd. And if you want to answer the question, just use that raise hand feature and I will give you permission to turn on your mic. But also please bear with us through some technical difficulties. This is our first time doing this. And so work with us through some growing pains. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Ivan to get us going.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the space. I'm going to share my screen. Eric, I think there's just disabled attendee screen sharing.
Should be good now.
Perfect. All right, I hope everyone can see this. Cool, so like Eric said, my name is Ivan. I was a trip leader, was one of the trip leaders on NUS'19. Definitely want to give Bike and Build a shout out for kind of like putting this space together, allowing folks to kind of come together and for us all to learn more about affordable housing. I think it is just especially important right now. I would like for this to be more of a conversation, so if you have any questions, please raise your hand, or if you have any personal experience and knowledge that you want to share, please do so. Or if you have, I'm sure you all have knowledge on some of these concepts we're going to talk about, please share. I would love that. Just some things I want to hit on before we start. I don't think this has been a very difficult time for our nation. I think for these past 2 weeks, the protests happening in the different cities, the senseless killings of Black individuals, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery. This has been a very difficult time. It's been very challenging. I know I've been doing a lot of self-reflection, and I think when we talk about affordable housing, we need to talk about the racist housing policies that have kind of created a divided nation, kind of a tale of two Americas. And I would challenge you all, myself included, that when we're seeing these protests, when we're seeing these murders happen, to critically think behind the formation of some of those desegregated communities. So my second thing, I want to, sorry to all the riders and leaders that have put in so much work and are not able to ride this year. You know, I know my team was very sad to hear that. So I just wanted to say that, and thank you all for still joining. It is greatly appreciated. And finally, the coronavirus pandemic has added just an enormous layer over the functionings of our society. And I know I've been personally doing a lot of thinking because I think it's exposed all of our societal ills. Some have called it the great equalizer, because for so many of us, people on this call, our families, people across this country are grappling with the effects of affording rent, paying for basic needs, paying for food, and unemployment. So this has been just an incredibly tough time. And I'm hoping that we use this time to think about how we can move forward and think differently about the way we have long operated, and how we have 40 million unemployed people. So those are my hopes for today. I'm just going to provide a brief introduction into affordable housing. So yeah, any questions, please let me know. Okay, so there seems to be like a lag when I click. So for our icebreaker today, HUD stands for the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development. They define affordable housing as us paying no more than 30% of our income towards rent. So if you pay more than 30% of your income towards rent, you are classified rent burdened by HUD's definition of housing affordability. So if you all have a moment, if you could take out a calculator, if you have access to one, and I would like for you all to calculate 30% of your income before taxes. So the way you do that is you're just going to take 0.3, you're going to multiply it by your monthly income before taxes, and whatever that amount is, HUD states that you should spend no more than that on your rent and basic utilities. So if you were spending more than 30% of your income and on rent and basic utilities, electric, gas, water, then you are rent burdened. So I would like for folks, if they feel comfortable, if they can maybe do like a raise of hands or like click the hand signal, just so we can kind of gauge how many folks here might be rent burdened. So we just want to give a couple minutes for that. Take another minute or so. Again, to calculate your affordability, you want to take 0.3, you want to multiply it by your monthly income before taxes, and whatever that number is what HUD states you should spend no more than when it comes to income and utilities, basic utilities being electricity, gas, water.
Hey, Ivan, we had a quick question from the Q&A box.
Yep.
Someone says, I live with 6 other people to disperse rent costs so that none of us are technically rent burdened. Is there any way to account for this in statistics?
So, no, I mean, I would just do it by whatever your share, your portion of the rent is. And then second, I know HUD states before taxes, but what I was going to state after is that personally, I calculate this after taxes because it just gives me a more realistic view of, what I'm spending my money on. So just food for thought for folks. Good question though. I don't know if Eric or Casey were able to tally. It's okay if we can't, but we can. I'm going to keep on moving unless anyone has any other questions. Okay. I will be periodically looking to my left. I got my notes here. So just, you know, just giving y'all a heads up. So this is just an example to hypothetical about, I kind of want to depict, you know, how affordable housing can affect quality of life. So one of the towns I biked through last year was La Crosse, Wisconsin. Beautiful town, loved it. So I did a little bit more research into it, and right now, actually, I want to ask this question first. Does anyone know what the federal minimum wage is? If so, if you could just put it in the chat box. Did we get a response on that? Eric or Casey?
Yes, 725, we have a guess.
Yes, yes. I also kind of gave that away. I'm realizing that now. Yes, federal minimum wage is $7.25. So you have a person here, hypothetical person that lives in La Crosse, Wisconsin. They work two jobs. Their first job, they get paid the minimum wage, $7.25. They work full-time, 40 hours a week. Their second job, this person takes care of their neighbor's kid during the weeknights for 2 hours at $10 an hour. So their monthly pay, they work 50 hours a week. Their monthly take-home pay before taxes is $1,260. Annual pay is a little over 20 grand. Now, average one-bedroom rent prices for an apartment in La Crosse, Wisconsin will run you about $600. For utilities, gas and electric, average cost $100. So right now you have someone who works 50 hours a week, two different jobs, paying more than 50% of their income on rent while working 50 hours. This does not account, this person has a child. This does not account for transportation, Wi-Fi, cable, clothing, health insurance. So I think sometimes the affordable housing conversation can get lost by people thinking that, you know, individuals aren't working. And I just, too often there are people that work full-time jobs, overtime, 2 or 3 jobs, and they still cannot, they can afford their rent. They can't afford their rent, they can pay their rent, but it comes at a severe cost of other basic necessities to meet in life. And right now, as of 2017, there are about 1.8 million Americans that work at or below the federal minimum wage. And 80.4 million workers between the ages of 16 and older get paid at the hourly. So they're not salary workers, they're hourly workers, which represents a little over half of all wage and salary workers. So just gonna move on to the next slide here. All right, so this is just different types of affordable housing units, housing programs. So you got rental, new construction, homeownership, rehab and repair, emergency shelters, homeless shelters, transitional shelters, supportive housing, permanent public housing. So a lot of these are self-explanatory. If anyone has any question on any of these, please let me know. But I was wondering if there was someone, one of the attendees that can maybe touch on what a transitional shelter is and or a supportive housing shelter. If anyone is willing to do that, that'd be great. Let Eric or Casey know.
Hi, I'm Kat. I was on C2C in 2016, and one of the transitional shelters that we got to work at in Danbury, Connecticut was for elderly folks who are transitioning out of homelessness. Often the story for them was they had a parent who they were the caretaker of, and when the parent died, the estate was split between multiple siblings and they lost their home. And so they were missing, as part of that, a lot of skills like how to find a job that wasn't taking care of their parents, how to cook for themselves, things like that. So we get to help them like install AC units and things like that as part of Bike and Build. And that's an example of a transitional shelter. People were typically there for like 6 months, I think.
It's awesome, Katrina. Thank you for sharing your experience. By any chance, do you have any knowledge of supportive housing?
I don't know if my mic's still on. Yeah, no, I don't.
Okay, no worries. Thank you so much. Greatly appreciate that. Any attendee has any knowledge on what supportive housing is that would like to share? It's okay if not. So supportive housing is another type of affordable housing that is geared towards individuals or families suffering from any mental health issues, substance abuse issues, or on the verge of homelessness. So this type of housing is geared towards those families and individuals, but they're affordable, but they usually have like social workers on site or like regularly scheduled social worker appointments. They'll have like, programming in their buildings geared towards these individuals. So it's more of like it tries to foster a supportive environment. Oftentimes individuals will also have roommates that may be experiencing similar issues as well. So that's another aspect that's key to affordable housing. And I do think the other ones are, pretty sure we have knowledge on, but I will be speaking more about public housing a little bit later. Just bear with my delay here when I switch these slides. Okay, so I think this is like super important when it comes to understanding the affordable housing crisis and how we got here. Because right now there's over 60,000 homeless people in New York City, close to 60,000 homeless people in LA. Homelessness is a critical issue across our country. And right now, as this pandemic is kind of exposing just so many communities and middle-class households, it's kind of showing how many of us are one paycheck away from being able to afford our mortgage or our rents, or one healthcare issue away from being able to afford basic necessities in life. And I think an important concept for us to understand that too often our federal government hasn't, adopted, or is that, right now housing is a commodity, it's not a right. And this viewpoint has never been successfully challenged. And too often, many political leaders and individuals, they consider homelessness a choice, a moral failure, etc. And I think we're starting to learn that that is not the case, and that a lot of these issues are tied to systemic poverty and also the history of our federal legislation, as well as racist housing policies that I'm going to go a little bit into, such as redlining and the Federal Housing Administration. So the Housing Act of 1937, it actually originally started, so a piece of legislation that was passed by US Congress, started off as pretty progressive, was going to be geared towards providing federal funding and building and giving the federal government power where to build affordable homes. And it was going to be geared towards low income to middle class households. Now, unfortunately, this piece of legislation was severely gutted by the National Association Real Estate Board, as well as by Southern Democrats at the time. And it ended up being geared only towards low-income households. It was racially segregated, and it was too often built in communities far from where it was intended. So this kind of gets into creating segregated communities. And specifically in the mid-1930s, so in 1933 and 1934, you had the U.S. Congress created what was called the Homeowners Loan Corporation and the Federal Housing Administration, which was, for the first time, federal government insured private mortgages and provided low interest rate loans for families and individuals. And it gave folks 20 to 30 years with low interest rates to pay off their mortgage, as well as they didn't have to put a significant amount of money down to buy a home. Now, this is what fueled the mass movement to suburbanization. It gave people the abilities to leave cities and live in the suburbs. The problem with this was that between the 1930s and 1960s, before the Fair Housing Act, which was passed in 1968, was that this was only available to white individuals and white families. This was not available to individuals who are Black or foreigners, which basically has created a tremendous wealth gap that we still feel to this day. And there was something, so an example of this was, for example, back in 1950, the Code of Ethics by the National Association of Real Estate Board stated this, and I pulled this from a great article called The Case for Reparations by Ta-Nehisi Coates that I wholeheartedly recommend everyone should read. And basically, the Code of Ethics by the Real Estate Board, National Association, was: a realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood any race or nationality or any individuals whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values. That was classified as foreigners and individuals who are Black. So these policies were racist housing policies pursued by our federal government. So I think that is an important thing that too often we forget. But the Color of Law, which I know is on the July Book Club, that is like what it's about and based, and it's a really important read. Oh, and redlining, do not want to forget that. So the way the Federal Housing Administration, so the FHA, the way they determined where to give out loans was based on a map, where based off the stability of the neighborhoods. So green colored areas of the map were rated as A. Those tended to be geared towards, like, usually where a lot of predominantly white individuals and families lived. However, neighborhoods where there was a single Black person or foreigner, they were rated as D, unstable, and they were colored red. And that's what term redlining comes from. And FHA would not basically provide loans or privatized mortgages at these low interest rates for neighborhoods that were redlining. I used to live in Crown Heights, Brooklyn. That neighborhood used to be redlining. So part two of this is during the 1950s, the federal government basically, I spoke about that, pursued, policies that segregated our cities and suburbs. And I think a good example of this, and I think this is pretty, a lot of people know about this, it's just Levittown, which is this massive neighborhood development that was built in Long Island. And this was popular. It was built in the 1950s, and this was geared towards World War II veterans returning home, looking to buy a home. So the FHA basically provided William Levitt the capital to develop over 17,000 homes. And then it guaranteed the individuals who bought these homes that they didn't have to put no money down, and they would have a guaranteed mortgage provided by the FHA, and they would have 20, 30 years to pay this off. The restriction was that this was available to whites only. So this is just a direct result where you have over 17,500 homes built that was solely available to whites only as a result of this policy.
Hey, Ivan, we had a quick question.
Yep.
We're not sure if this comes up later in your presentation at all, but can you speak a bit to predatory lending?
Yeah. So, Case for Reparations by Ta-Nehisi Coates, I wholeheartedly recommend folks read it because he goes into further detail into these racist housing policies. So what happened was when individuals who are Black weren't able to get guaranteed loans and mortgages provided by the federal government, predatory lenders started dishing out contracts. So individuals who were Black had to buy their home via a contract, which was basically they got all the disadvantages of what it means to be a renter and none of the advantages of actually owning a home. So they had to put these are like classroom discussions that go into a lot of detail, but basically what these predatory lenders would do is they would try and scare white individuals and families that Black individuals are going to be moving into their neighborhoods. And they would do that by paying individuals who may be Black and putting up signs that Black individuals are coming into their neighborhood. And that's where a lot of white individuals and families fled. So they sold their homes for the cheap. And these lenders flipped their homes and made Black individuals and families that were moving in pay twice the price, where they had to put a significant amount of money down. They had to pay high interest rates. And then they, if they missed a month of rent, then they would lose their security deposit and they would have to foreclose and they would be evicted. They would have to foreclose the home. The lender would flip it for another family. There's a very good article by The Atlantic that goes into further detail. It's called the Contract Buyers League, which is about a group of African Americans that kind of took a stand in the early 1970s regarding these contracts that they had to basically pay. They took their case to court, and unfortunately they lost. But this again takes place in the early 1970s, Chicago. It's called the Contract Buyers League. There's a lot more that goes into these predatory lending practices, but that's just like a highlight of that. Part 3, so like what we're looking at now, 1960s to now, is that there have been ongoing funding cuts by Congress to HUD. So it really hasn't been an expansion of the Section 8 voucher program and public housing, which I'm going to expound upon later. We do have what's called LIHTC, low-income housing tax credit, which provides tax credits to private developers that guarantee they're going to build affordable housing. Too often, this is geared towards solely for low-income communities and in low-income communities. So again, it's like this concentration of poverty, which is a problem of its own. The color of law also explores this. The lack of a living wage, as we talked a little bit earlier, the federal minimum wage is $7.25, and there's a graph here showing which states have increased it since then. But you could work a full-time job and still be severely rent burdened. We had the subprime mortgage crisis 2007, which has greatly impacted I think it was over 3 million Americans had to foreclose on their homes, which pushed them into rental markets. And then now they're competing with individuals who are struggling to afford their rents or looking for affordable places to live. You also run into NIMBYism, not in my backyard, and community opposition when it comes to building affordable housing in their neighborhoods. And there's a great show on HBO called Show Me a Hero that explores like the city of Yonkers, this predominantly white neighborhood grappling with the fact that affordable housing was being constructed in their neighborhood. It's a great show. It kind of hits on all the ins and outs of what it takes, unfortunately, of what it takes to build affordable housing in neighborhoods where they don't want it built.
Hey, Ivan, we had a quick question in the Q&A box.
Yep.
Thank you, Ivan, for clearly articulating the racist scaffolding on which housing policies and practices have been built. Would it be fair to say that housing markets are largely undergirded by white supremacy? In other words, can we reach a public consensus that part of what constitutes a home's value is how well it comports with a racist ideology?
Yeah, yes, we can. There's a great quote in the article that I mentioned, again, The Case for Reparations by Ta-Nehisi Coates. It's for free. It's on The Atlantic, where he was challenging this notion of white flight. It was basically saying white individuals and families at that time, they had a choice to not leave and actually live in integrated communities, but they, too often, a majority of them fled to the suburbs. And this one quote from this like white homeowner says, you know, I see this Black family that just moved into my neighborhood and they're a kind family, but every time I see them, I keep thinking about how my property decreased in value by $2,000. You know, so this other notion that was driving folks outside of racism or tied to racism was the fact that they were worried about their properties of their home decreasing in value because we have, you know, African Americans moving into their neighborhood. And, you know, I will send out links to different like resources that I'm sharing. That way we all can do our own like research and learn more. But there was just, you know, an investigation done on Long Island a couple years ago where a lot of individuals went undercover to go buy homes and meet with different real estate agents. And too often real estate agents would just, you know, if they see, you know, an African American or a Latino or an Asian person, they would go to those specific communities to show them homes. You know, so it was like kind of, you know, being prejudiced and kind of stereotyping them to like specific neighborhoods and not, you know, not integration, not encouraging integration in our neighborhoods. So absolutely. And I'm going to get into this more. You know, this gets very like complex with like gentrification and displacement. So, you know, good question. Thank you for asking it. And whether you can reach a public consensus on that, that's a whole nother, you know, political ball game. But, you know, my belief is yes. And I do think there's like a building consensus, especially among like political leaders, urban planners, that, you know, the results of our communities being so segregated is in one part causing what we're seeing today. These protests, these senseless murders of, you know, Black individuals, of homelessness, the concentration of poverty, you know, this ginormous wealth gap that exists, whether you're white or Black. This graph is, there's a slogan, it's really popular here in New York, and I'm sure in many other places, the rent is simply too damn high. And this map shows the amount of available units per every 100 renters that is available to individuals that are qualified as extremely low income by HUD standards, which basically means they live at the poverty level, which is 30% AMI. Area median income, AMI, is calculated every year by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And what it does is it takes, for example, Philadelphia, it'll calculate all of the annual household incomes in the Philadelphia area and come up with the median income, and that is 100% of AMI. So that's what they use to gauge the affordability metrics. So if your annual household income is at 30% of AMI for that given area, you are at the poverty level. So there's no state in our country that has the adequate supply to meet the demand for extremely low income renters. And those that are severely lacking are, you know, California, Nevada, Arizona, Oregon, Florida, Texas, New York. So I can also share this presentation for folks to see. So this is tied to what it would take to be able to afford a 2-bedroom rental apartment. And so right here, you know, as we can see, if you live in Colorado, you would need to make $25 an hour to be able to afford a 2-bedroom apartment. And I think this is just a really good graph showing it how expensive it is to afford. And these wages are based off folks paying only up to 30% of their income towards rent. So affordable 2-bedroom apartments, this is what you would need to make. So yeah. Okay, minimum wage 2020, we have established federal minimum wage is $7.25. And then we've seen what it would take to afford a 2-bedroom apartment across the United States. Now look at what the minimum wage is. New York, $12.50, Michigan, $9.65, Minnesota, $10, Montana, $8.65, Washington, $13.50. So clearly there's a ginormous gap between the minimum wage and what it would take to pay an affordable price for a home. And I think another layer that this pandemic has truly shown me is how a lot of the people that are being paid minimum wage are essential workers. So right now, the people still showing up to work are the ones bagging our groceries, cashiers, our supers, folks cleaning up, our janitors, just our everyday workers that truly make the world work. Too often they are not paid a living wage, but we are expecting them to come to work because that is how we are still to this day functioning right now amid a catastrophe. So I found, when I was re-looking at this presentation, I was like, damn, like this, this really strikes a chord for me. And I'm sure to many of you, because I'm sure that a lot of us are, probably have family members or friends or ourselves have gone through these instances. And if you want to share, please feel free to do so. Yeah.
Ivan, it does look like we have a question. Carolyn, I'm going to turn your mic on real quick. And if you weren't trying to ask a question, just let us know.
Okay, sorry, I am probably not handling the technology correctly. Am I able to ask a question?
Yep, we can hear you
now. Oh, okay. Well, I was interested in the slide where you were talking about the low-income housing tax credits and
Yeah.
Alluding to that there hasn't been enough funding dedicated to HUD. And I was interested in that for, we are in the Midwest. I also find that they are not very effective tools, but for different reasons. And so, I kind of sometimes think that we should be trying to advocate for changes in, for example, what is the definition of income that constitutes low income. That would be one of the things that causes it not to be very effective where we are. My question to you is, are there places where you have seen LIHTC working well? Are there arguments to be made for it is working without changes needed? More funding would help solve the problem.
Yeah. No, well, you're right, Carolyn. Thank you for your question. So, one, I think there's a pretty general consensus that, public housing, the concentration of public housing, it was a failure. Some people have more of the opinion that Section 8 voucher programs work because it gives the opportunity of the renter to find a home wherever they can. The problem is that there hasn't been any funding to that program, I think, in nearly a decade. There's like a 10-year waiting list, for example, for the Philadelphia Housing Authority, same here in New York. I do not have much knowledge on LIHTC, so I wouldn't be able to speak to that, but I think LIHTC was kind of falling in the predicament where they would build affordable housing, but it would be like, again, the reconcentration of poverty. And I think, for example, what some cities have done, such as New York City, and this is where I practice tenant rights, so this is what I kind of know, they have a mandatory inclusionary housing policy now, which is basically 4 areas in New York City from here on out that get rezoned, which allows developers to build higher, so 10 floors instead of 5-floor apartment building, that they are now required 20% of those apartments in that building need to be affordable of different categories. So that was a big win for cities, and I think it helps, but the issue that we're running into now is that it is not meeting the demand for those that fall in that extremely low income category. And folks that fall into the extremely low income category can be folks who they just have fixed incomes. They live off Social Security or they live off their pension, because they're retired, or they have a physical disability, or they just work a minimum wage job full time and they cannot afford anything more. So I think, I hope that answers your question a little bit better. But yeah, I would need to look more into LIHTC specifically. But I know those have been the criticisms of the program. It's just that it's reconcentrating poverty and it's just not meeting the demand that exists. because LIHTC is geared towards just private developers using it, basically.
Thank you.
Moving on. Yeah, no problem. Thank you for your question. Just moving on, there's just a couple quotes here that I find that have resonated with me, and just again getting to the importance of housing. It truly affects every aspect of our lives. And I know there are folks on my team and people we've encountered who, unfortunately, have experienced being on the verge of homelessness or homelessness, and it's really eye opener just how that affects you physically and mentally. So it's a quote from Matthew Desmond from the book Evicted, which is on the June Bike and Build book club. My next slide is also just another quote that I find, that really resonated with me and my team last year. And, if there's someone on the call that is, willing to name some benefits to people in communities when they have access to affordable housing, please hop on and shout out some of those benefits if you like. That's all right. If not, some of the benefits when it comes to affordable housing is just healthier living, both physically and mentally, ability to focus in school, stable home environments, better nutrition, improved job prospects, et cetera. Citizen involvement, really strengthening the fabric of your neighborhood, of your community, and just building that long-standing tenancy and like raising your families there. It means a lot. I know I am running a little pressed for time here, but I'm going to try and speed it up. But if you have questions, please still ask me. Present day affordable housing issues. So again, I work in tenant rights here in Brooklyn, and just a lot of what I see here is this topic here, gentrification. I'm sure a lot of folks on this call have heard the term, are familiar with the term. I know I have personally contributed to gentrification when I moved to New York City. And basically gentrification is, more affluent individuals and businesses moving into longstanding neighborhoods that tend to be Black and brown communities, tend to be low-income, working class, moderate income neighborhoods that have lived there 30, 40 years. This is a very hot topic in cities, just because, again, dating back to our history and, a lot of non-Black families moving into these suburbs, all of a sudden with, our generation, the millennials, and then generations after us, there's this strong desire to move back into cities. And predatory landlords and speculative lenders are basically using that opportunity to conduct illegal buyouts, displace longstanding tenants, mass evictions, to kind of flip the apartment, get someone like me to live there and pay twice the rate. This is a critical issue impacting towns and cities across the country. I know there's folks on this call that have probably had conversations about this. And it's such a visceral experience just because of the history behind it. And I hope that, I was able to provide some of that history and just, that mass exodus to suburbanization, and now, folks wanting to live in cities. Not everyone, but a lot of us. Again, there's a lack of federal funding for affordable housing programs, the Section 8 voucher for public housing authorities. There's a lack of a living wage, we went over that with the federal minimum wage. And then still, unfortunately, to this day, there's racial discrimination, as we see, and there is LGBT discrimination. I'm going to share that resource about the undercover investigation that went with Black and brown individuals trying to buy homes in Long Island. And then my organization actually just won a human rights case for a client of ours who is trans, and landlord sexually harassed them and refused to rent an apartment to them because of their identity. So that is just, it's a sad reoccurrence that continues to happen too often today. And again, it is not just affordability. This is where a lot of my work comes into play. So what I do is I meet with tenants who are experiencing landlord harassment or condition issues such as no heat, no hot water, mice, rats, bed bugs, cockroaches, water leaks, mold, mildew, lead in their apartments. And the landlord just refuses to fix the underlying issues, sometimes in hopes to get them to move out so they can rent it, so they can renovate it and rent it to someone willing to pay a higher price. So when we are advocating for affordable housing, we're also advocating for adequate and safe affordable housing, because too often when renters or homeowners, when they buy an affordable home or rent an affordable home, now there's this whole like other ballgame of structural deficiencies in those apartments that have been neglected. Evicted goes into that a lot. So like I wholeheartedly, when you read that, be prepared, because he describes that in pretty vivid detail. So HUD programs, so you got public housing providers, which are basically, you see this a lot. Well, let's say if you on your bicycle trips, Chicago, in Texas, in New York, in California, Seattle, they tend to be homogeneous apartment buildings where a lot that are geared towards low income and working class communities, where they pay 30% of their rent and the federal government kind of subsidizes the rest. The Section 8 voucher is similar to public housing in the sense that it's a voucher where the tenant tries to find an apartment to rent. They pay 30% and the federal government kind of subsidizes the rest. And they do that through a contract between the landlord, the tenant, and HUD. The problem with public housing is that it has created concentrated poverty. So I work in Brownsville, Brooklyn, which has the highest concentration of public housing in the United States. So there's about a square radius of close to 2 miles that is just filled with public housing, these big brick buildings. And then with the Section 8 voucher is that there's extensive waiting lists. Right now, if a client tells me, hey, I want to be on the Section 8 voucher program, it's like, you could put your name there, but it's a 10-year wait list. Again, people don't want it built in their backyard, in their community too often. Again, not everyone, but this is an issue that still happens. Does not cover moderate income households, and too often landlords discriminate against Section 8 vouchers. They'll say, which is a source of income discrimination, but it's a burdensome case to bring in court. And too often landlords would be like, we don't accept public benefits, we don't accept like subsidies. Too often that happens across this country with folks that have a Section 8 voucher. Evicted also highlights this. And again, too often with Section 8 vouchers, they're gonna end up, oftentimes they end up living in those communities that tend to be just a concentration of racialized poverty. The Atlantic has another article, how housing policy is failing the poor, that goes into more detail into our public housing programs for individuals and families in need.
Yeah, we got another question in the Q&A box.
Yep.
Housing opportunities have clearly disenfranchised people of color, but there are many poor white people that live in similarly bad positions. How do we approach or get buy-in from these white folks who feel as if they haven't been given any opportunity?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, I know I personally saw that when I biked in towns in Indiana, Montana, North Dakota. So for example, in North Dakota, we had a meeting with state, federal, and local nonprofits and local government agencies. And their main issue was that the only homeless shelter in Bismarck, North Dakota closed down, and they did not receive any state funding for affordable housing programs. So Bismarck basically relied on the city of Bismarck, federal funding, which has been kind of stagnant with the income growth, and nonprofits. So I think this is an issue that is definitely an affliction towards impoverished folks of all race and ethnicity backgrounds. Is really, you got to vote, and you got to like vote. I would hope you vote or bring up the affordable housing issue and the need for affordable housing, because again, too often political leaders and individuals see this as it's a choice. Homelessness is a choice. It's a failure of morality. You know, you could just get a job. Well, the reality is there are many homeless people that work full-time jobs and they still cannot pay their rent. So I think, you know, causes such as biking bills and biking across the country, but voting in leaders that share this same belief or commonalities and are willing to push it forward. And I do think housing issue is starting to become more of an issue. It seems like with every election cycle, and housing has long been an emblem of like American citizenship, the American dream. And I think the reality of it is that so many of us that are struggling just don't have the access to it, despite working, or despite, something happening in their lives that is preventing them from working and they have to live on a fixed income. Well, should that person be homeless or not? I think that's the question that folks in charge need to answer. And there are some cities, there's a slide here at the end, Salt Lake City back in 2015, for example, they did a housing first model where the city government was directly providing apartments to homeless people. And that's like a pretty like revolutionary model when it comes to like housing. So it's another really good question. Just gonna breeze by this slide real quick. Right now, about 65% of people living in the US own a home. There are more households with millennials at the head of that household than any other generation that are in poverty. So I think right now, our generation, millennials, myself included, we've seen the subprime mortgage crisis. We've seen the Great Recession of 2008. And now we are basically experiencing coronavirus pandemic. We've got over 40 million people unemployed. And, it's just really scary, this recession that we are going to embark in, and we don't know what the future holds. So, seeing this statistic while I was doing research kind of worried me for, folks in my generation. And we also dominate the ranks of the nation's renters. So a lot of us are starting to rent instead of buy homes. And I do think that is like as a result of just some of these economic obstacles that we are undergoing as a nation. All right, I think my next slide is a little bit more positive than all these slides before, so just bear with me. I think it's important to talk about solutions, and these are solutions that towns and cities across our country are taking. Right now we need a call of action. We need the government to step in and help with funding for housing programs across our country. Oregon, for example, I believe Oregon was the first state to pass statewide rent control, which is fantastic, which, basically the state of Oregon decides if there should be a rent increase for their state renters. So taking that option out of the landlord. So basically, that stems evictions. A landlord can't just say, hey, I want to raise your rent $200 every month for this year. It's up to this independent body created by the state of Oregon to decide whether there should be a rent increase. So universal rent control is a topic that a lot of folks are, discussing as a possible solution. We got good cause evictions, which basically means, you cannot be evicted from your apartment or from your home unless there is a good cause, unless you're like not paying rent, or if you're a nuisance, or if you're harassing your neighbors, for example. That one, I know in the state of New York, that has been a bill proposal, but it has not passed. Expanding the Section 8 voucher program, expanding down payment assistance for low income and moderate income families. We got the community land trust model, which is basically, this is another pretty cool model, I think, which is where, a local nonprofit will basically develop affordable housing on like a plot of land or in a neighborhood, and they'll rent it to a family or individual in need. They'll buy it, and it meets the affordability requirement for the family. And then if the family wants to move out, they cannot profit from the home. It'll go back to the nonprofit, and they'll basically rent it or sell it to another family in need. So it's kind of just like extending the availability of home ownership to people that need it, biking across the country. So bear with me here with this little slide delay. These are just different affordable housing nonprofit providers. If you know of any others, drop them in the chat box. So we work a lot with Habitat for Humanity, Rebuilding Together. We worked with Mercy Housing last year. So some really cool nonprofits out there in small towns, rural America, and cities, you know, that are meeting this demand of folks in need. And you know, just want to provide a quick example. Like, we worked in a small town in Vermont, and their local nonprofit, what they did was that for families in need, they helped do repairs, such as, like, you know, proper weatherization for people's roofs, or fixing their heating system for winter, you know. So affordable housing nonprofit providers looks a lot more than building affordable housing and managing affordable housing. It can also look as nonprofits, you know, fixing condition issues for folks that are in need and can't afford to, like, fix these underlying issues. So it could look in many different ways. So my next couple of slides talk about the affordable housing curriculum for Bike and Build when we're on the trip. That consists of group discussions, interviews with affordable housing affiliates, families that have received any affordable housing subsidies or live in affordable housing properties, and affordable housing days, which is a new concept that came last year. I'm gonna talk about that a little bit more. So I think a really cool thing that my group did last year, and I know other groups did as well that rode last year, was we came up with these collective knowledge meetings where a group of participants on the Bike and Build team formed like an affordable housing committee, and once a week or once every 2 weeks, we would kind of have a discussion amongst the group about affordable housing. And what I thought was really unique was that volunteers would do research on topics that the group were interested in and wanted to learn more about, and they would present it to the team. So it was kind of this peer-to-peer learning model, which I thought was like really fantastic and kind of helped keep the conversation of affordable housing alive and well as we biked and as we did our build days. And then on these affordable housing days, it was, instead of a build day, we had 2 days last summer that were affordable housing days, where basically instead of doing a build, you would learn more about affordable housing. And that could be meeting with affordable housing nonprofit providers, a political leader, or with your team to kind of discuss affordable housing. And for our affordable housing day last year in Bismarck, North Dakota, that's where we had that meeting with, you know, all the different organizations working on affordable housing issues in Bismarck, North Dakota. So, and it's open to however you want to do it, you know, guest speakers, group activities, you know, we try to make it engaging and fun. And I think it was, you know, I think it was a good success. It was really great to see people who did not know much about affordable housing at the start of the trip volunteer, take a deep dive into whatever they cared and were curious about learning, and then present it to the team. I thought that was fantastic. The next slide is, you know, we have an affordable housing library on the trip. 2 of those key books we're reading this summer, June, Evicted, July, The Color of Law. And I think those 2 books really do a great job on the history of the affordable housing crisis, those racist housing policies, the affordable housing issues today, and the segregation of our communities, and like potential solutions on moving forward. So for folks that are on this call, you know, I definitely recommend you read them. I know I'm going to reread them. I think those are just books to just keep on. And The Case for Reparations by Ta-Nehisi Coates, he does a fantastic job in going into this deep dive into these policies that kind of created this big wealth gap that we're seeing today. And yeah, I believe this is a video by the Daily Show. Jon Stewart back in 2015 talks a little bit more about that housing first model that Salt Lake City put into place. And again, it was just providing homes to folks who are homeless and kind of the success rates that they had. I don't think we have time to watch it, but I'm going to share the link to folks who are on this call. That way you can watch it. It was a good snippet. And yeah, I truly hope that you all have the opportunity to take on this trip. If not, get involved in your communities, learn more about affordable housing issues impacting your neighborhoods, your state. And when you do community service, just remember, like, there is a magnificent impact we all can have when we are helping others in this housing cause. And that is it. I think I went over time. I am sorry. If you have any questions, please let me know. I know I talked a lot, but thank you all.
Thank you, Ivan. Yeah, if anybody has any last questions, feel free to pop them in the Q&A box. Ivan, thank you so much for talking for this past hour or so and spending time with us this evening. It's always fantastic seeing your face, and it's always great to hear about the work that you do and the well of knowledge that you can continually draw from when talking about affordable housing. So again, thank you very much. As a reminder, so after this call, this is the first one we've done. So we're going to be sending out a survey after this to everybody who attended to kind of get your feedback on how it went, how the format is. So this is going to be a 10 to 12 week series. And so helping us grow it as we move through the summer, whether it's in terms of content you want to see or formatting issues, technical things, whatever. And so we'll be sending out that survey. With that survey, we'll include the links that Ivan mentioned that he would share after this call. If you've enjoyed what you've seen and learned this evening and have felt inspired to donate to Bike and Build to support us and support this work in this series, feel free to do so at the link that Casey's about to drop in the chat box. But again, thank you, Ivan. Thank you, everybody, for attending, whether you're from 2020 or some year in the past, or you're not an alum, whoever you are. Thank you for coming out. And we will see you next week when we hear from Blair and Molly about their work with United for Alice. I think it's gonna be a great talk, and I really hope everybody can make it. So have a good night.
Thank you all.